Okay, so in this particular video we're going to look at the costs of the firm, but you really do need to have understood the production function, which is the idea that you add more and more units of input, the variable factor, because we're in the short run, remember, and then that to a fixed amount of capital, and what happens to the marginal and the average product, because it's that determines the costs in the short run for the firm. So if you remember, there's 4 factors of production, and each factor of production here is going to lead us to some output. So that's what we're looking for. How much output are we getting? But they're also going to be adding to our costs. And so therefore, that is the way that we can work out the cost per unit of output. So we need to know the cost and we need to know their productivity. So there's a link between those things. Productivity is, of course, the number of factors by the output. In other words, how many factors I need in order to get the output. So go back if you don't remember this. This is the law of diminishing marginal and average returns. The workers are specializing here, and so therefore the marginal product initially rises, but then this is it here, the law of diminishing returns states that as a firm adds more and more of the variable factor, initially the marginal product's going to rise due to specialization, but then because they're trying to use the same capital and they're getting in each other's way and they're having to wait, etc., the marginal product will fall, and so therefore the average product will follow it. So therefore the average product will go up and then it will go down. But you need to remember this particular rule, which is, of course, that if the margin is above the average, doesn't matter whether the margin is rising or falling, the average will rise. If the margin's above it, the average rises. Now, the examiner often tries to get you to say if the margin's rising, the average is rising. If the margin is falling, the average is falling. That's not the case. It's about whether it's above it or below it. So try to remember that, and don't be fooled in the exam or multiple choice, really, often with those things. Okay, so in order, as I say, to make up the costs of production, we need to consider this production, and the key thing is that the cost of employing every new worker, the assumption is we pay them the same wage. Okay, now that might not be realistic, and we'll change it much later on in the course, but for now that is what's going to happen. So each additional factor of production adds to costs, increases output, therefore we get the cost per unit. So hopefully you can see that if you've got the 15th worker, we're paying them £20 an hour, they increase output by 40, so the costs for that unit of output are 50p, i.e. it is the £20 of cost divided by the output, okay, by the quantity. So each one of these units here is going to cost the firm 50p, whereas if we have our 16th worker, we're still adding £20 to our cost, but they now are less productive, only 30 units, and so therefore the argument is that 20 divided by the 30, 67p. It's absolutely vital that you get the idea that if the marginal product is falling, the average cost, or in this case the marginal cost, would be rising. Okay, so that's important. Alright, let's have a look. The short run cost curves of the firm. So as before, you need to consider the total costs, that's the sum of all costs, all these variable costs, etc., added up, and the fixed costs, the average cost, which is the total cost of producing goods divided by output, and the marginal cost. That's the change in these total costs here when I'm producing one more good. So whereas in the product side, when we did productivity and we looked at total product, marginal product, it was the change in the variable factor. This is actually the change in the number of goods now. Okay, so the first thing we look at is the total cost. So the total cost of any firm are the total fixed and the total variable. Remember, short run we have some fixed costs and we have some variable costs. Okay, variable costs are usually labour, fixed costs are usually capital. So we have to ask ourselves, how do I work out these total costs? So The total fixed cost is going to be a straight line, and that's because these fixed costs do not change, and so therefore the output can go up whatever we want it to, and the total fixed cost will remain constant. Okay, now that's only the case for fixed costs, so be careful. Variable costs, of course, when we don't produce anything, are going to be nothing, but we're going to add, let's say we were using that previous example, £20 each time. So the total variable cost goes up by a constant amount. Put them together. Here's your variable cost, here's your fixed costs. So therefore the total cost is going to be the addition of both of those lines, and so try to remember the total cost always starts somewhere up the cost axis, okay, because of those fixed costs. You've still got to pay the fixed costs even if you don't produce anything, because you can't change the fixed costs in the short run. Okay, how do we get to average cost? Well, we know the average total cost is going to be all these total costs divided by the unit of output. So the total cost divided by quantity of goods and services being produced by the firm, and the total is split into the fixed and the variable. So the average total is going to be the average fixed added to the average variable. So we've now got to look at what does the shape of the average fixed look like, what does the shape of the average variable look like. Okay, so this is the shape of the average fixed cost, and the reason is that as the output rises, the average fixed cost is going to continuously fall and it won't hit the axis, because what you're doing is you're dividing this fixed sum of fixed costs by an ever increasing quantity. So if your fixed costs are 100 and your quantity was 1 here, you would be having £100 of average fixed cost. Double the quantity, you're now dividing this 100 by 2, so you're getting 50. So it goes down quite considerably when it starts, and then as it goes on you're dividing the same number by an ever increasing quantity until you get to much lower and lower amounts, but it's never going to turn up. Okay. Now the other thing that is really useful for some multi-choice questions is that therefore if I look at a quantity here and I hit my average fixed cost and I come across here, this box here is going to measure the total fixed costs. Same here, if this quantity, there's my average, which is measured on this axis, so that box there, the area under the curve, is going to be the total fixed costs. So it's a constant. That area under the curve is the same number, the same value of fixed costs, and so sometimes the examiner will give you maybe two quantities here and one average cost and ask you to work out the other one. So you should be able to do that by remembering the area under the curve is a constant. Okay, let's have a look at the variable costs then. So just as a reminder, in terms of the law of diminishing average returns, remember the average product rose, then the average product fell. Okay, and that's because of the law of diminishing average returns. So there's a part A to this curve here where the average product, okay, of the extra worker starts to rise, and so as we're adding the same amount to our costs each time because we're increasing our units of variable factor, the argument is that as they become more productive, the average cost of producing these goods is going to go down because you're adding the same to your costs, but they're giving you more and more output. So you're dividing those costs by an ever increasing amount of output. So the average cost initially falls because of the law of diminishing average returns. Then there's an element here B where the average product eventually falls, and so the average variable costs turn up. And it's really quite important this, because later on we're going to talk about efficiency, and of course this point here is the point at which we've got the highest level of average product. So productivity, okay, is at its maximum. So this point here, the lowest point of the average variable cost curve in the short run here, is a point of maximum productivity of our workers, average productivity of our workers. So it's a very important point. We're going to call it productive efficiency. Okay, all right. But what we've got to do now, and this is an awkward diagram, and maybe you need to know it just for multiple choice work, but it explains the shape of the variable and the total, is we've got to take our variable cost, there it is, and we've got to take our fixed cost, there it is, and we've got to add them together to get to our total cost. So we take at any point here, there's my variable, and then go and find that, and I've got to add the fixed cost to it. But remember, we're adding a large sum, then we're adding as we go along. So hopefully this will help you to see that. Okay, there it is. The average variable cost at any quantity is here. Then I'm adding this very large, this is the red line here, this very large fixed cost. So my average total cost is above my average variable cost by a large amount. Whereas here, my variable costs are here, but I'm only adding a small amount of average fixed cost to them. So the argument is that if you draw your average variable, your average total has got to get closer and closer to it. Okay, and as I say, you can see these areas here. Initially A, that's when the average total is falling because both the average variable is falling and the average fixed is falling. Okay, to this point. Then you get a time when the average variable starts to go up, this range here B, but the average fixed is also falling, and so it's still bringing the total cost down, the average total cost down. But then you get a range where the small fall in the average fixed is now not offsetting that big rise in the average variable, and so the average total turns up. So that explains the shape of those curves. I've never seen a question where you have to explain that. But these are the curves that you need to draw in the exam. Try and get them so that the average total cost, average variable cost, they get closer and closer together, because the difference between them is the average fixed cost, which is ever decreasing number. Okay, if you don't do that in the exam, it doesn't really matter. It's not one of the things that they're looking for, but that is the best diagram to draw. And make sure, this is one thing to do, make sure that the lowest point of the ATC, here it is to the right of the lowest point of the AVC. In other words, you've got to make sure when you draw them that you draw your total cost bottoming out just to the right, a little bit to the right of the average variable cost. That would be something that perhaps the examiner is going to be looking for. Okay, so you've built the total cost, now the average variable, average fixed, added together, got your average total. What about marginal? Well, the marginal costs are the change in the total cost divided by the change in the quantity of output. Change in total cost divided by change in quantity. So we need to remember, well, what are these total costs? They are the total fixed and the total variable. So it's the change in the total fixed cost divided by a quantity, but these fixed costs do not change. So because of that, the only thing that is changing when we're looking at marginal cost is actually the variable cost, certainly in the short run. Okay, so therefore marginal costs only reflect changes in variable costs, and that's going to be important later when you maybe set a question about what's the effect on the firm of a increasing costs. You've got to be careful which costs are you talking about. Okay, but that's something to consider for later on. So nearly at the end, this is the shape of the marginal cost curve, very similar to what we said before. When the marginal product curve is rising, the marginal cost is falling. Again, we're adding more and more variable factor. Each factor is now more efficient at this point, more productive, giving us more and more output, so our marginal cost would go down. Then you get a range where the marginal product curve here is falling, which means that the marginal cost is going up. And again, this is about marginal productivity. It's not so important later on when we do efficiencies, but that's when your marginal workers are at their most efficient, as it were. So when you put them all together, this is what you need for the exam. You need a variable cost curve, you need a lovely average total cost, making sure that the bottom point of the average total is to the right of the bottom point of the average variable, and then you stick your marginal cost curve through the bottom point. So hopefully that will help you to understand short run costs. All we've got to do now, consider long run costs.